On the afternoon of September 15, 1940, the Prime Minister of Great Britain stood in a dimly lit underground bunker 50 feet beneath the suburban soil of Uxbridge. Winston Churchill was silent, his hands clasped behind his back, his knuckles white as he stared down at a massive map table spanning the room. Across the surface of that map, women in uniform used long wooden croupier rakes to push colored counters across the grid, tracking dozens of incoming German air formations surging across the English Channel. On the wall above, a giant electric tote board glowed with red, yellow, and green lights, showing every available British fighter squadron in southeast England either engaged, refuelings, or scrambling into the sky. Churchill watched as light after light turned red, signifying that unit after unit was committed to battle. He turned to the tall, lean Air Vice Marshal standing quietly beside him, a New Zealander whose calm demeanor masked weeks of catastrophic exhaustion. Churchill asked a single, quiet question. "What other reserves have we?" The officer looked at the Prime Minister, his face unreadable, and delivered 4 words that summarized the fate of the free world. "There are none." The man who delivered that chilling answer was Air Vice Marshal Keith Park. On that afternoon, commanding No. 11 Group, he was holding the door against the most formidable air force on the planet. If his squadrons failed, the Luftwaffe would win control of the skies, and Adolf Hitler's invasion barges would cross the narrow sea. By nightfall, against all odds, Park's tactical discipline and relentless control had broken the back of the German offensive. September 15th would go down in history as Battle of Britain Day, the turning point of the entire campaign. Yet, less than 12 weeks after delivering that miracle, Keith Park was called into a cold office at the Air Ministry in London. He was not awarded a medal. He was not offered a victory parade. Instead, he was stripped of his command, booted out of No. 11 Group, and banished to a quiet training posting in the countryside. The commander who had fought and won the most crucial air sector in human history was discarded by his own superiors in the hour of his victory. To understand how a nation could throw away the man who had just saved it, you have to look past the dramatic aerial dogfights and look inside the bitter, carpeted hallways of the British military establishment. The downfall of Keith Park is not a story of battlefield failure. It is a story of internal jealousy, inflated egos, political maneuvering, and a catastrophic doctrine known as the Big Wing Controversy. While Park's pilots were dying in the skies over Kent and Sussex to keep Britain alive, senior commanders in adjacent sectors and high-ranking staff officers in London were actively plotting his removal. Right alongside his superior and close friend, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, Keith Park fell victim to an internal palace coup engineered by men who claimed they knew how to fight the war better from behind a desk. It remains one of the most disgraceful political betrayals in military history, and to see how the trap was set, we must go back to the beginning of the crisis and look at the man who was handed the impossible. Keith Rodney Park was not a typical British senior officer. Born in Thames, New Zealand in 1892, he was the son of a Scottish geology professor. He was a man shaped by the rugged outdoors of the Pacific rather than the elite boarding schools of England. When the First World War broke out, Park served as an artillery officer at Gallipoli, surviving the nightmare of the trenches before transferring to the Royal Flying Corps. In the skies over the Western Front, he became a fighter ace, shooting down 20 enemy aircraft, being shot down twice himself, and earning the Military Cross with Bar. He learned the brutal reality of aerial combat not through textbooks, but through the oil-splattered windscreen of a fighter biplane. He knew what bullets did to metal and flesh. He knew what exhaustion did to a pilot's reaction time. Most importantly, he learned that war was a matter of mathematics, logistics, and ruthless practicality, not grand theoretical posturing. When the Second World War erupted in September 1939, Park was serving as Senior Air Staff Officer to Hugh Dowding at Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory. Dowding, a cold and methodical administrator known to his men as Stuffy, recognized in Park a kindred spirit. Both men were intensely analytical, utterly indifferent to high society politics, and fiercely protective of the young men under their command. In April 1940, as the threat of a German air assault became imminent, Dowding appointed Keith Park to command No. 11 Group. It was the ultimate test of faith. No. 11 Group was the frontline shield of the Royal Air Force. Its territory encompassed the entire southeast of England, including London, the strategic shipping lanes of the Thames estuary, and the vital fighter bases of Kent and Sussex. If Germany attacked Britain, No. 11 Group would bear 80% of the impact. Park did not command from a cushioned seat behind a mahogany desk. He was an operational officer who lived in the field. He owned a personal Hawker Hurricane, painted in custom markings, which he flew daily between his sector airfields, Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, Kenley, Tangmere, and North Weald. He landed unannounced at damaged stations, walked through cratered runways, spoke directly to exhausted mechanics, and sat with young pilots in the dispersal huts between scrambles. His men called him the Skipper. He was a tall, silver-haired figure who projected a quiet, unbreakable authority. But beneath that calm exterior was a mind working constantly to solve a terrifying logistical equation. The problem facing Keith Park in the summer of 1940 was defined by time and distance. German bombers taking off from newly captured bases in northern France needed only 20 to 30 minutes to cross the English Channel and reach their targets in Kent or London. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters escorting those bombers were fast, deadly, and operating right at the absolute limit of their fuel range. If German formations crossed the coast without being intercepted, they could obliterate Britain's radar stations, destroy airfield hangars, and wipe out fighter squadrons while they were still parked on the ground. To prevent total disaster, Park had to rely entirely on the revolutionary defense network designed by his chief, Hugh Dowding. The Dowding system was a masterpiece of early high-technology integration. Chain-home radar stations along the coast detected incoming German raids while they were still forming over France. This raw data was telephoned immediately to the filter room at Bentley Priory, where operators calculated the size, altitude, and course of the enemy. The validated intelligence was then instantly flashed to Keith Park's underground control room at Uxbridge. There, controllers sat on an elevated gallery above a giant map board, looking down through large glass windows. Using wireless radio communications, controllers at Uxbridge and at local sector stations could direct airborne British fighters directly onto the path of incoming raids. It was the world's first integrated air defense system, but its success depended entirely on how Keith Park managed his precious, limited resources. Park's tactical doctrine was simple, precise, and dictated by the harsh realities of geography. Because No. 11 Group sat directly across the narrowest part of the channel, his airfields had virtually no early warning margin. When radar detected a raid forming over France, Park could not afford to wait 40 minutes for 50 or 60 fighters to assemble into a massive, organized fleet before taking off. If he waited that long, the German bombers would have already dropped their loads on Kentish airfields and turned for home before the British planes even cleared the clouds. Instead, Park ordered his controllers to scramble small, fast, flexible units, single squadrons of 12 aircraft, or at most pairs of squadrons, the moment a threat was identified. These small formations were ordered to gain altitude as quickly as possible and climb into the sun. Their objective was not necessarily to destroy every single German aircraft in a cinematic dogfight. Their objective was to disrupt the enemy's operational pattern. Park instructed his pilots to attack the heavy German bomber streams before they reached their primary targets, forcing them to drop their payloads prematurely into fields or the sea. Meanwhile, other Hawker Hurricane and Supermarine Spitfire squadrons would engage the high-altitude Messerschmitt escorts, tying them up and burning away their limited fuel reserves. It was a strategy of proportional response and continuous harassment. Park understood that fighter command did not need to score a decisive, theatrical knockout blow in a single afternoon. It simply needed to survive, inflict steady, unsustainable losses on the Luftwaffe day after day, and keep its own airfields operational. As long as the Royal Air Force remained an active, dangerous force in the sky, Adolf Hitler could not launch Operation Sea Lion, the planned amphibious invasion of the British Isles. The German army could not cross the channel in flat-bottomed river barges if British fighters were free to dive from the clouds and strafe their landing craft. Keith Park was playing a high-stakes game of operational preservation. Every single Hurricane, Spitfire, and trained pilot was a gold coin in a rapidly diminishing vault. Park spent those coins with agonizing discipline, never deploying a single fighter more than was absolutely necessary to meet a specific threat. When the Battle of Britain began in earnest in July 1940, the Luftwaffe focused initially on attacking British shipping convoys in the English Channel, trying to draw fighter command into a war of attrition over the open water. Park refused to take the bait. He kept his main strength held back, sending only small patrols to protect essential shipping. Furious at this refusal to collapse, the German High Command shifted its strategy in early August. Vice Marshal Hermann Göring launched Adlerangriff, Operation Eagle Attack. The Luftwaffe turned its full force against No. 11 Group's infrastructure, launching massive, relentless waves of bombers aimed directly at radar towers, sector command stations, and coastal airfields. This was the crucible of the Battle of Britain. Day after day, under a clear, cloudless blue sky, hundreds of German bombers, escorted by clouds of fighters, crossed the coast of Kent. Airfields like Biggin Hill and Kenley were hit repeatedly, their runways churned into smoking craters, their operations rooms destroyed, their communications cables severed. Mechanics worked through the night under floodlights, patching airframes and filling bomb craters with gravel, while unexploded bombs still ticked beneath the soil. Pilots were flying 5 or 6 sorties every day, landing on scorched grass, scrambling out of their cockpits with bloodshot eyes, swallowing cold tea, and taking off again into the smoke. Through this terrifying trial, Keith Park was everywhere. He flew his gray and blue Hurricane from one battered sector station to another, stepping out of the cockpit into scenes of total devastation, offering steady encouragement to station commanders, and personally reorganizing damaged operations centers on the spot. He knew his men were reaching the absolute threshold of human endurance. He also knew that his group could not sustain this pressure alone indefinitely. To keep No. 11 Group from crumbling, Park needed support from his neighbor to the north, No. 12 Group, commanded by Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory. It was here that the tragic rift began, a division that would start as a tactical debate and end as a toxic political conspiracy. Trafford Leigh-Mallory was a very different man from Keith Park. Ambitious, status-conscious, and politically connected within the Air Ministry, Leigh-Mallory held a deep personal resentment toward both Park and Dowding. He felt that his own command, No. 12 Group, which covered the Midlands and East Anglia, was being relegated to a backwater sideshow, while Keith Park received all the publicity, glory, and operational focus. More than that, Leigh-Mallory fundamentally disagreed with the way Park and Dowding were fighting the war. Leigh-Mallory was a devout disciple of the traditional Royal Air Force doctrine established years earlier by Lord Trenchard. This doctrine dictated that air power should always be aggressive, offensive, and applied in massed, overwhelming force. Leigh-Mallory argued that Park's strategy of sending up single squadrons or pairs of squadrons was a timid, piecemeal mistake. He believed it exposed British pilots to superior German numbers and resulted in inconclusive engagements. Instead, Leigh-Mallory proposed a radically different concept that became known as the Big Wing. The champion of the Big Wing inside No. 12 Group was one of the most famous and charismatic figures in the entire Royal Air Force, Squadron Leader Douglas Bader. Bader was a brilliant, fiercely competitive fighter pilot who had lost both of his legs in a pre-war flying accident but had fought his way back into a cockpit on metal prosthetics. Flying from No. 12 Group's station at Duxford, Bader argued that rather than scrambling individual squadrons, the RAF should assemble entire fighter wings composed of 3, 4, or even 5 squadrons, 36 to 60 fighters, flying in a massive, coordinated air armadas. Bader believed that if a big wing hit a German raid, it would deliver a devastating psychological and physical blow, annihilating enemy formations in a single sweeping battle. On paper, to anyone sitting in a comfortable London office, the big wing sounded magnificent, aggressive, and decisive. It appealed to the military instinct for grand offensive action. But to Keith Park, who was actually standing on the geographic firing line in Kent, the big wing was not merely impractical, it was dangerously flawed. The physics of the big wing were completely unsuited to the geographic reality of No. 11 Group. Assembling 40 or 50 fighters into a single disciplined tactical formation took an enormous amount of time. Pilots had to scramble from different airfields, rendezvous over a specific landmark, climb slowly to altitude, and form up in large V-shaped groups before turning toward the enemy. This process regularly took anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes. In the spacious sky over No. 12 Group in the Midlands, 40 miles north of London, Leigh-Mallory had the luxury of that extra time. But in Keith Park's sector in the southeast, 30 minutes was an eternity. If Park attempted to form big wings, German bombers would cross the channel, drop their payloads on his sector airfields, and be halfway back to France before his massed wing had even finished climbing to altitude. Furthermore, Park pointed out that assembling huge formations consumed vast amounts of aviation fuel. By the time a big wing finally located the enemy, its fighters were often running low on petrol and had only a few minutes of combat time remaining before they were forced to return to base. Park's small, rapid response squadrons, by contrast, were already airborne, at altitude, and engaging the enemy long before the bombers reached their targets. The operational agreement between No. 11 Group and No. 12 Group was supposed to be simple and cooperative. When radar detected a massive German raid heading for London or Kent, Keith Park would scramble his own No. 11 Group squadrons to engage the incoming enemy formations directly. Simultaneously, Park would telephone Trafford Leigh-Mallory at No. 12 Group and request that Leigh-Mallory send squadrons south to perform a specific, crucial task. Standing guard over No. 11 Group's vulnerable, undefended airfields such as Biggin Hill, Kenley, and Hornchurch, while Park's own fighters were engaged over the coast. It was a sensible division of labor. Park would fight the forward battle. Leigh-Mallory would cover his back. But in practice, the arrangement broke down completely, leading to mounting operational frustration and bitter arguments. Time after time, when Keith Park requested urgent airfield protection from No. 12 Group, Leigh-Mallory did not send individual squadrons straight to the requested airfields to patrol the skies over Kent. Instead, Leigh-Mallory used Park's calls for help as an opportunity to test and demonstrate his beloved big wing theory. He would order Bader and the Duxford wing to form up into their massive 36 or 60 plane formations before flying south. By the time the Duxford big wing finally arrived over No. 11 Group's territory, the German raids had often already struck. On multiple occasions during the terrifying weeks of August 1940, while Leigh-Mallory's fighters were spending 30 minutes circling in the sky north of the Thames, trying to form their massive parade ground wings, German bombers flew over No. 11 Group's sector airfields completely unmolested, dropping hundreds of tons of high explosives onto Biggin Hill and Kenley, killing ground crews, destroying operations buildings, and cratering runways. Park was incandescent with frustration. He was losing vital airfields and ground personnel because his northern neighbor was more interested in demonstrating a theoretical mass attack concept than in performing the immediate, unglamorous duty of airfield defense. Park sent urgent, detailed operational reports to Fighter Command Headquarters and to the Air Ministry, laying out the precise timing of events, demonstrating that delayed responses were leaving his stations exposed, and asking for strict discipline to be enforced. However, back in London, a parallel reality was being constructed, one that favored Trafford Leigh-Mallory. In the high-stakes world of military PR and bureaucratic politics, The Big Wing had a massive advantage over Keith Park's methodical strategy. It produced sensational, eye-catching casualty statistics. When Douglas Bader and the Duxford Big Wing did manage to catch a German raid on its way home, the sight of 50 British fighters diving out of the sun at once created immense chaos. In the wild, confusing dogfights that followed, dozens of British pilots would fire at the same falling German bombers. When those pilots returned to base, they submitted combat reports claiming victory over every aircraft they had fired upon. Because several pilots were shooting at the same plane, victory claims were unknowingly multiplied 3- or 4-fold. The Duxford Big Wing began submitting astounding, record-breaking combat reports to the Air Ministry, claiming to have shot down dozens of German planes in a single afternoon with virtually no losses of their own. These inflated claims were accepted without verification by senior staff officers in London, who were desperate for dramatic good news. To the air staff, it appeared that Leigh-Mallory's Big Wing was achieving sweeping, heroic victories, while Keith Park's No. 11 Group was locked in a grinding, bloody war of attrition with heavy casualties. In reality, modern historical analysis of German Luftwaffe loss records from those exact days reveals that the Big Wing's actual destruction of enemy aircraft was a fraction of what they claimed, and that many of their engagements occurred long after the German bombers had already dropped their payloads on British targets. But at the time, the paper numbers looked spectacular. Inside the Air Ministry, a powerful clique of officers began aligning against Dowding and Park. The ringleader of this internal opposition was Air Vice Marshal William Sholto Douglas, the Deputy Chief of the Air Staff. Sholto Douglas was an ambitious administrator who had long coveted Hugh Dowding's position as head of Fighter Command. He saw in the Big Wing debate an ideal wedge issue to discredit Dowding's cautious leadership and remove Keith Park from his influential post. Sholto Douglas actively cultivated Trafford Leigh-Mallory, listening sympathetically to his complaints, praising the Duxford Big Wing's reported successes, and feeding narrative political critiques to high-ranking government ministers. While this political poison was spreading behind closed doors in London, Keith Park was fighting the absolute climax of the campaign on the ground. By early September 1940, the strain on No. 11 Group had reached an intolerable limit. Park had lost dozens of experienced flight commanders and squadron leaders. His replacement pilots were young men pulled fresh out of operational training units with as few as 10 total hours of flight time in a Spitfire or Hurricane. Many were shot down on their very first operational patrol. Sector airfields were running on emergency generator power, using mobile operations vans tucked into woods because their primary command buildings had been reduced to rubble. Then, on September 7th, the nature of the war shifted dramatically. In response to a small British bombing raid on Berlin, and believing that Fighter Command was down to its final handful of aircraft, Hermann Göring ordered a fatal change in German strategy. The Luftwaffe stopped bombing No. 11 Group's sector airfields and turned its full weight toward the massive, deliberate destruction of London. For Keith Park, this change in strategy was a double-edged sword. For the civilian population of London, it was the beginning of the horror of the Blitz. But for No. 11 Group, it was the miracle that saved them. The relentless daily bombing of his airfields ceased instantly. Runways were repaired, communication lines were restored, and exhausted pilots finally received a few hours of unbroken sleep. Furthermore, by targeting London, the Luftwaffe was forced to fly deeper into British airspace, giving Keith Park's radar stations and controllers more warning time than they had ever had before. This set the stage for the dramatic showdown on September 15th. When the German High Command launched 2 massive, concentrated waves of over 1,000 aircraft aimed directly at the heart of London, Keith Park was ready. Using his extra warning time, he scrambled every single squadron in No. 11 Group, positioning them in pairs to meet the enemy streams in a continuous, disciplined gauntlet. As the German bombers approached London, they were attacked relentlessly at every step of their journey by wave after wave of Hurricanes and Spitfires. When Winston Churchill stood in the Uxbridge bunker that afternoon and heard Park state that there were no reserves left, It was because Park had placed every single fighter he possessed directly into the path of the enemy. The tactical gamble paid off with historic clarity. The Luftwaffe formations were shattered, scattered, and forced to jettison their bombs over open fields before fleeing back across the Channel. German air crews, who had been told by their commanders that the RAF was completely destroyed, returned to France in shock at the ferocious, endless resistance they had just encountered. 2 days later, Adolf Hitler quietly postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The Royal Air Force had won the Battle of Britain. The threat of an immediate German invasion of Britain was over forever. In any rational world, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding and Air Vice Marshal Keith Park would have been hailed as national heroes, decorated with the country's highest honors, and given permanent places of prestige in military history. Instead, the moment the immediate crisis passed, the political machinery in London accelerated their removal. Trafford Leigh-Mallory and Sholto Douglas moved quickly to capitalize on the end of active fighting. They argued that while Dowding and Park had managed to survive the defense of Britain, their cautious, defensive mindset made them entirely unfit to lead the Royal Air Force into the next phase of the war, an aggressive, offensive air campaign over occupied Europe. On October 17, 1940, while German bombs were still falling on London at night, an extraordinary meeting was convened at the Air Ministry. Ostensibly called to discuss future fighter tactics and night defense strategy, the meeting was organized and chaired by Sholto Douglas. In a move that violated every standard of military hierarchy and courtesy, Trafford Leigh-Mallory brought Squadron Leader Douglas Bader into the room to directly confront and debate his ultimate operational commander, Keith Park, in front of the assembled senior air marshals. During the meeting, Park found himself subjected to an aggressive, pre-planned cross-examination. Bader and Leigh-Mallory argued forcefully that the Big Wing was the only effective way to fight the Luftwaffe, claiming that if they had been allowed to use big wings throughout August, the RAF would have destroyed twice as many German planes with half as many losses. Park, tired, dignified, and relying entirely on real operational facts, pointed out that the geographic realities of No. 11 Group made big wings impossible for rapid interception, and that delayed responses had repeatedly left his airfields exposed to destruction. Nobody in the room supported Keith Park. Hugh Dowding, exhausted by months of unrelenting stress and weakened by years of bureaucratic combat with the Air Ministry, sat mostly silent, unable or unwilling to protect his star subordinate. The meeting was not a genuine tactical discussion. It was a kangaroo court designed to establish a formal record that Park and Dowding were stubborn, rigid, and resistant to modern tactical innovation. The execution of the plot was swift. On November 25, 1940, less than 2 months after saving Britain, Hugh Dowding was summarily removed from his post as head of Fighter Command. He was replaced by the very man who had plotted his downfall, Air Vice Marshal William Sholto Douglas. Just weeks later, in December 1940, the final blow was struck against Keith Park. He was formally relieved of his command of No. 11 Group. In a move of calculated institutional insult, his replacement as commander of No. 11 Group was none other than Trafford Leigh-Mallory, the man who had spent the entire Battle of Britain undermining Park's orders and leaving his airfields exposed. Park was given no public recognition, no official thanks from the government, and no meaningful input into future operational strategy. He was assigned to a minor administrative post as the commander of No. 23 Group, a quiet pilot training unit in the north of England. The two men who had engineered, organized, and executed the tactical victory that saved Western democracy were swept out of sight like inconvenient dust. To modernize, this cold removal seems almost incomprehensible, but it illustrates a timeless, brutal truth about war and organizational politics. In the crucible of maximum crisis, pragmatic, brilliant, field-tested leaders like Keith Park are indispensable because they deliver survival and victory. But once the immediate crisis has passed and safety returns, political manipulators, charismatic ideologues, and ambitious bureaucrats reassert their control, casting aside the very heroes whose competence made their return to power possible. However, the story of Keith Park does not end in the quiet shadow of a training command in 1940. History has a way of testing theories in the cold light of reality, and the tragic irony of what followed completely exposed the incompetence of the men who had ousted him. Taking control of Fighter Command in early 1941, Sholto Douglas and Trafford Leigh-Mallory immediately discarded Park's defensive doctrines and implemented their aggressive big wing strategy on a massive scale. They initiated a series of large-scale offensive operations over occupied France known as rhubarbs and circuses. Huge sweeps of hundreds of British Spitfires and Hurricanes were sent across the English Channel to provoke the Luftwaffe into mass air battles. The result was an absolute operational disaster. Just as Keith Park had warned during the October meeting, flying massive, slow-assembling wings over long distances gave the enemy plenty of warning time. The German Luftwaffe in France, now commanded by experienced tactical leaders like Adolf Galland, simply stood back, picked their moments, and used superior altitude and tactical positioning to bounce the predictable British formations. Throughout 1941, Leigh-Mallory's Big Wing Offensive cost Fighter Command over 500 irreplaceable pilots killed or captured, while destroying very few German aircraft and having zero impact on the war on the ground. The British lost 4 fighters for every single German plane they managed to shoot down. The aggressive Big Wing doctrine, hailed by staff officers as the ultimate weapon of modern air power, proved to be an utterly reckless, wasteful failure that bled the Royal Air Force of the very victory gains Keith Park had worked so hard to secure. Meanwhile, as the situation in the Mediterranean theater grew desperate in 1942, the Air Ministry was forced to realize that they needed a real combat commander to save a critical frontline post. The isolated island fortress of Malta was under a catastrophic siege, pounded daily by the combined air fleets of the German Luftwaffe and the Italian Regia Aeronautica under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. If Malta fell, Axis supply lines to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps in North Africa would be completely secure, threatening the Suez Canal and the entire Allied position in the Middle East. In July 1942, the Air Ministry turned back to the man they had discarded. Keith Park was appointed Air Officer commanding Malta. When Park arrived on the sun-baked, bomb-shattered island, he found a situation eerily similar to the one he had faced at No. 11 Group 2 years earlier. Malta's fighter forces were outnumbered, exhausted, short of fuel, and getting pounded on their runways. The existing British air commander on the island had been using fighters in small defensive patrols over the harbor, allowing German bombers to approach unmolested. Park acted instantly. He threw out the existing playbook and implemented the exact same tactical system he had perfected over the fields of Kent. He ordered his controllers to use radar to detect raids far out over the Mediterranean Sea, and he instructed his Spitfire pilots to launch rapid, forward interceptions over the open water before the bombers reached the island's coast. He instituted the strict forward interception doctrine, demanding that fighters dive directly into incoming bomber streams to break up their formations over the sea. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Within 2 weeks of Keith Park taking command, the aerial siege of Malta was broken. German and Italian bomber losses soared to unsustainable levels, and Allied shipping convoys began reaching the island's harbors with crucial supplies of fuel, food, and ammunition. From his unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean, Park then launched aggressive strike operations against Axis supply convoys heading to North Africa, starving Erwin Rommel of the tanks and fuel he desperately needed at El Alamein. Park's victory at Malta was an absolute tactical masterpiece. It demonstrated beyond any shadow of doubt that his methods during the Battle of Britain were not the result of timid defensiveness, but the product of a brilliant, flexible, tactical mind that understood how to achieve maximum combat effect with limited operational resources. Park would go on to serve with distinction as the Air Commander-in-Chief of Allied Air Forces in Southeast Asia in 1945, working alongside General William Slim and Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten to oversee the air supply networks that sustained the liberation of Burma. Wherever he went, Keith Park delivered quiet, devastatingly efficient operational success. Yet, despite his extraordinary record of achievement across 3 separate theaters of the war, Park remained a largely forgotten figure in post-war Britain. When the war ended, Trafford Leigh-Mallory had died in an air crash in 1944 on his way to take up a command in Asia, and Sholto Douglas went on to receive grand titles and promotions, eventually being elevated to Marshal of the Royal Air Force. Keith Park, by contrast, was retired from the Royal Air Force in 1946 with the rank of Air Chief Marshal, but he was conspicuously passed over for the highest imperial honors and peerages that were freely handed out to other, far less successful commanders. Disillusioned by the toxic politics of the British establishment, Park returned home to his native New Zealand. He settled in Auckland, where he worked quietly in civil aviation, served as an Auckland City Councillor, and devoted his time to local civic causes and veterans organizations. He never wrote a self-serving memoir, he never engaged in public mudslinging with his former rivals, and he never demanded the credit that was so rightfully owed to him. He lived out his days as a quiet, dignified elder statesman, content in the knowledge that he had done his duty when his country needed him most. It was only in the decades following his death in 1975 that military historians, gaining access to declassified operational records and German loss statistics, fully realized the magnificent scale of Keith Park's achievement and the sheer injustice of his removal. Modern military consensus is absolute. The tactics championed by Keith Park and protected by Hugh Dowding were the only reason Britain survived the summer of 1940. Had Trafford Leigh-Mallory's Big Wing Doctrine been adopted in August 1940, No. 11 Group's airfields would have been utterly destroyed. Fighter Command would have been blinded, and the sky over the English Channel would have been handed to the Luftwaffe on a silver platter. Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Lord Tedder, who served as Chief of the Air Staff after the war, paid the ultimate posthumous tribute to the New Zealander when he wrote, "If ever any one man won the Battle of Britain, he did. I don't think it is realized how much the health and strength of Fighter Command were due to his brilliant direction. Unquestionably, his was the supreme tactical achievement and judgment in September 1940. Today, a bronze statue of Air Chief Marshal Sir Keith Park stands proudly in Waterloo Place in London, not far from Buckingham Palace. Cast in bronze, his tall, lean figure stands wearing his pilot's service dress, gazing calmly upward into the sky he once defended. It is a late, fitting monument to a man who asked for no personal glory, who refused to play political games while young men were dying, and who carried the crushing weight of a nation's survival on his shoulders with calm, unshakable discipline. Keith Park was the tactical brain that saved the free world. He won the battle that saved civilization, suffered the sting of institutional betrayal in the very hour of his triumph, and then went on to prove his genius all over again on the other side of the world. His story stands as a lasting testament to the triumph of quiet competence over loud ambition, and a timeless reminder that true leadership is measured not by the titles you hold, but by the quiet courage with which you stand your ground when everything is on the line.